All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. I'm gonna go ahead and say I am not a public speaker. I'm a chef. I'm usually in the back of a kitchen, so bear with me on this. So for those who don't know me, I am a chef. I run 3 restaurants right now, and when I was approached to do this talk, and the theme was preserve, the first things that came to mind was, oh, preservation of food. But then I kept thinking about it, and I was in my room and I look at this stack of journals and notebooks that I have, and there's 2 parts of my life: the chef with all my little notebooks with like scratches and measurements and how many cups goes into whatever recipe, and those are ways that I preserve information to do my job. And then there's also the diaries, like life journals, and it's almost obsessive. So I'm like looking through this, and I have journals back to when I was 15, right? So I'm looking at these things that I still have in Pittsburgh, and I realized that I really like to live in the past, and I treasure these moments. So thinking of this, I was like, put some thought on the fact that why do we preserve things or moments? And I'm huge, and we talk about with some people that we had a chance to talk, like preserving tradition, preserving memories when they're at peak, when you're like extremely happy, when you have a moment that was sad but formative to you. Those are things that you want to keep with you. And I go back to these pages and I can relive these moments and kind of go back to like who I am now is due to the things that happen. So in 2007, I moved to Pittsburgh from Puerto Rico. And I remember being like this like really cold winter. It was January 2007. And I used to live in Mount Washington, and I used to take the incline to go to school and cross that bridge, Smithfield Bridge. And I had no clue how to dress for Pittsburgh weather. And this like lady, very sweet, like stopped me on the track and was like, "You need like a heavier coat, honey." But I was so homesick because I grew up like 2 blocks from the beach. Like I used to surf, like this, like it was like a complete opposite of what my life was. And I was going to school, and I had no friends who speak Spanish, and it was just this, not sad, but like that moment of being extremely homesick. And I remember going to the strip district and going to Reina's and finding that there was a Mexican store that had all these products from, different like Caribbean and like Latin countries, and I bought all the ingredients to make empanadas. So every culture has a version of that. Like if you're Italian, you have some sort of like version of like a dough filled with meat or whatever filling, and it's either baked or deep fried, and everybody does pierogies, empanadas, empanadillas, whatever. Every culture has that comfort, delicious, like fried or baked thing. So I wanted to recreate a dish that, will bring me back to memories of my grandmother and my mom cooking with me when I was a child. So I remember going back to my apartment and making this dish, the empanada, and it was exactly the one that I used to make when I was like 12 years old, and it was like ground beef and cheese and deep fry. I call it the trashy empanada because it's American cheese that goes in it. And it's something that it's definitely not fine dining, but it's very comforting to me. And it took me back to who I am and my heritage, which at the time was really important to me to remember that I was a Puerto Rican woman living in Pittsburgh, and I still wanted to represent, like, keep that with me and keep traditions alive. And I wanted to make sure that through food I could tell a story. Through the years, I realized that in every restaurant that I work, I had a version of this empanada just the way it was, which is absolutely fantastic, because even when I was at Spoon, which was like a fine dining establishment back then, I had an empanada that anybody could eat with their hands at, a white tablecloth environment. Yeah, it's great. But, when you think about this, like, preserving, like, tradition through food, I think you have to look at how in the last, like, 15, 20 years, the food scene in Pittsburgh and across the nation have so many influence from all over the country. We have access to ingredients from everywhere around the world, which leads to almost like a melting pot of cuisines, and sometimes it's really easy to move away from preserving a style of food and like that tradition of a certain area or region. When I started working at Legume back in the day, can't remember how long ago, Legume was in Regent Square, and our purpose was to preserve food from this region, from Western PA, which was interesting because, as you know, like Pittsburgh, you only get, for example, like 3 weeks worth of strawberries and 2 weeks of like asparagus, and the rest of the time is cold, and you get like potatoes and cabbage and celeriac, and nobody really wants to eat white like food all the time. So I remember questioning with Trevet Hooper, the owner and chef at the time, like, how are we gonna make this happen? How are we gonna eat this beautiful food from people that we want to buy, that are our friends, and we want to support these farmers and buy locally? How are we going to do this in a way that makes sense financially for them, because we want to buy in bulk, right? And we want to keep like using these flavors through the years. And well, the first thing that we did, we got like this huge book of like pickling. So everything was pickled at Legume at the time. Here's the problem with pickling. It's vinegar, right? You're preserving food in vinegar, and it's delicious, but there's a moment when like it gets boring, like your mouth and it gets fatigued. So from then, we started experimenting with lactic fermentation, which again, like is great, and it roots back to Eastern Europeans like settling in this area and traditions that are being kept alive. And this is, bless you, this is 10 years ago, before it was cool to do fermentation back. Everybody's now fermenting everything. But it had a purpose, and the purpose was that all these ingredients that we're buying in the summer and springtime, we were gonna use them in the winter. We started dehydrating things, curing meats, and all of these traditions that came from many countries around the world were being rooted back in Pittsburgh. And that's a beautiful example and a personal example of how I learned to love and kept like what Western PA means for me, and relationships with farmers and relationship with people that grow the food that I serve. But going back to the utilizing food to preserve your cultural heritage, there is a movement back, like in the last 2 years, of chefs all over the country going back to cooking food from where they're from. So one of my dear friends from DC, Kwame, who just won an award for Rising Star Chef, the guy is cooking Western African food in Washington, D.C. at a really high-end level. Like, he's doing like fine dining, and it's something that haven't been done. Like ethnic, I hate saying ethnic food, but ethnic food is usually relegated to cheap, affordable, and like hole in the wall. And that's great, because it's like food should be accessible, and I truly believe that. But when you are able to take the food that you grew up with and elevate it and present it to a whole nother group of guests that otherwise would have not touched your establishment, is a thing of beauty. He's getting all like international attention, and you are seeing this great moment all across the world with chef like going back to the roots. We have like chef cooking Filipino food and getting like national accolades. Puerto Rican food, Caribbean food, African food. Like it's really important to me to think of ways that we as a community and a city can support this though. So, you know, when I think, like, why do we want to preserve this? I think it's if we are not supporting restaurants or supporting, like, chefs who are cooking heritage food, we are missing on the opportunity of the younger generation of cooks to really understand what our cities and, like, our food and cultures is. I was just reading this article about how the French bistro is being lost because everybody wants to cook like international global cuisine. Can you imagine a world going to France and not having like the opportunity to eat at a bistro, right? So it's really, really important to start paying attention to these things and seek out ways to transmit the traditions and the skills. So this is great. No, sorry. I don't speak again. But yeah, when I moved to Pittsburgh and I started like cooking in different kitchens, part of like the reason that I decided that I wanted to stay true to this was because, believe it or not, like it's still really hard to be a female in this industry, but it's also really hard to maintain who you are as a Latino woman in kitchens. And for me, that like, I was trying to present myself as a professional chef, a badass chef, and like go and do things, but at the same time, there's this level of like, why do I cook and what makes me happy, right? And that comes from nurturing people. Like you cook to feed people, to like make sure that people are happy, to set table, and like it's breaking bread, right? It's like the idea of food as there's so many conversations that can happen when you're sitting on a table and sharing a good meal, or so many ideas that a cook can present, storytelling through food. But I felt like I really couldn't do that if I was cooking French food, because this is not the food that I grew up cooking. I have no real connection to it. And how are you able to have these meaningful conversations and these moments with people when you're cooking something that doesn't really make you happy? So that's when, through different conversations with like my chef and clients, I quit my last job and decided to go to a very small place, and one of our restaurants does Puerto Rican cuisine, which is the most strange and rewarding thing at the same time that I have done in the last couple of years. I'm serving mofongo, which is a traditional dish from Puerto Rico, which is smashed plantain stuffed with meats and stuff like that. It's the national dish of Puerto Rico. We're making two types, well, I'm not making, my pastry chef was here around, is making two traditional breads from back home. And the reaction of people is always like really interesting. People either love it or are slightly confused about it. Because honestly, like how many of you are familiar with what Puerto Rican food is? Great, awesome, love all of you. But a lot of people do not understand the difference between other islands in the Caribbean or Latin American cuisine, and that's fine. Like, it's my job to help people understand that. But when Diane, who is my pastry chef, I was explaining to her this different breads and different recipes, part of the process was to find how we were gonna make them. And you'll be surprised that a lot of like, not surprised, a lot of like Latin American and like Puerto Rican recipes make no sense. Yeah, like we were looking for these recipes and it's like a little pinch of this and a little pinch of that. And like when I'm thinking of this, I'm like, yeah, that's why my notebooks with recipes make sense, right? Documenting the things, this preserving these memories, preserving that knowledge, that in many Latin countries, it's translated, like it's passed by voice. Like your grandma taught you how to make something, or your mom taught you how to make something, and it's not like, oh, you need 5 grams of that. It's like, taste this. Does it taste right? Does that have enough acid? Does it have enough salt or sugar? And I think that's a really beautiful, like, romanticized idea of cooking. But back to the journals, those moments of like stamping something that I can go back like 10 years from now and look back and understand that it would be the same thing for years to come, that I can trust in that and build on like trial and error. And like Diane did an amazing job like recreating flavors and texture from memory and from like some notes that I had. And that to me is so fascinating, how like a combination of having something set that anybody can follow, but also the power of memory, the power of remembering what something tastes like or feels like. And not only on food, but on everything. I think of like things that I want to preserve, and that was one of the questions on this prep. It's like tradition, and tradition through memories and things that makes it happy. You know, we continue to want to find a way to like bring community together and ultimately like find ourselves in a position where like everybody's living their best life. And to me, food is on a personal way, the answer to that. Like food can bring so many conversations, can actually like make change happen. And when we create an accessible food system, when we share knowledge, when we share and break bread, that truly can make a difference in our community. So anyway, thank you so much. Questions?